The scorching summer sun of 1879 beat down mercilessly on Abbotsville, as Abigail Winters struggled to balance her wares in the crowded market square, painfully aware of the whispers and judgmental stares that followed her every move. At 22, she was already branded as damaged goods, the daughter of the town drunk who'd squandered away their family's ranch before dying face down in a ditch last winter, leaving her with nothing but debts and a tarnished reputation. Look at her, thinking she can just set up shop alongside decent folk. A voice sneered loud enough for her to hear as she arranged her homemade preserves and needlework on a rickety table she'd managed to secure at the far edge of the marketplace. Abigail kept her eyes down, her fingers trembling slightly as she straightened a jar of blackberry jam. This market day represented her last chance at scraping together enough money to pay the back taxes on the small cabin she now called home. She couldn't afford to let their cruel words chase her away, no matter how much they stung. "Selling Winters trash, are we?" A burly man named Silas Thompson knocked against her table deliberately, causing several jars to wobble precariously. Surprised anyone would touch anything those hands have made. A few onlookers chuckled, emboldened by Silas's taunting. Abigail bit her lip hard enough to taste blood, determined not to give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She'd weathered far worse storms than this. "Careful there, Thompson." The deep voice cut through the marketplace like a knife. "Would be a shame if those jars fell and cut someone, especially you." The crowd parted as Mitchell Larson stepped forward, his tall frame casting a long shadow across her humble display. Abigail had seen him around town before everyone knew the Larson family owned the largest cattle operation this side of the territory. He wasn't like the other cowboys who came to town looking for trouble. There was something different about his steady gaze and the quiet authority he carried. Silas's face reddened. "This ain't your business, Larson." Mitchell's expression remained impassive, but his eyes held a dangerous glint. "I'm making it my business." His hand rested casually on his holstered revolver, not a threat, just a reminder. A tense silence fell over the market as Silas weighed his options, then finally backed away with a muttered curse. The onlookers dispersed, suddenly finding interest in the other market stalls. Mitchell turned to Abigail, his expression softening. "Madam." He tipped his hat and reached for one of her jars of peach preserves. "How much?" 25 cents, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He placed a silver dollar on her table. "I'll take 4. I don't need your charity, Mr. Larson." Abigail's chin lifted slightly, her pride the one thing she refused to surrender. A hint of a smile touched his lips. "It's not charity when the goods are worth every penny." His eyes met hers, and for the first time in months, Abigail felt seen not as James Winters' pitiful daughter but as herself. "Let me help you with these." Without waiting for permission, Mitchell began selecting items from her table, carefully placing jars and folded pieces of embroidery into a canvas bag he'd been carrying. The marketplace had gone eerily quiet. Abigail could feel dozens of eyes on them, watching this unbelievable scene unfold. Mitchell Larson, heir to the Rocking L Ranch, was not only speaking to her but purchasing her goods in full view of the town's most notorious gossips. "They're all watching," she whispered, mortified. Mitchell's gaze swept around the market, his stare challenging anyone to comment. No one did. Then, in a gesture that would be talked about for weeks to come, he extended his hand to her. "Miss Winters, would you allow me to escort you to lunch at the hotel? I hear Mrs. Patterson makes a fine chicken and dumplings on Saturdays." Abigail stared at his outstretched hand, hardly daring to believe this was happening. Accepting his invitation would be like pouring kerosene on the already blazing gossip fire. And yet, the genuine warmth in his eyes made her reconsider everything she thought she knew about self-preservation. Taking a deep breath, she placed her hand in his. A collective gasp rippled through the marketplace. Several women covered their mouths in shock. The town barber actually dropped his cigar. But not a single person dared to laugh or jeer, not with Mitchell Larson's steely gaze sweeping over them, daring anyone to say a word against the woman whose hand he now held. "I'd be honored, Mr. Larson," Abigail said, finding unexpected strength in her voice. As Mitchell helped her pack up the remainder of her unsold goods, he leaned close. "You know they'll talk." "They already do," she replied with a small smile. "At least now they'll have something interesting to say." The hotel dining room fell silent when they entered, but Mitchell seemed oblivious to the stares as he pulled out a chair for Abigail at the best table by the window. Mrs. Patterson herself appeared, her usual pinched expression softened by confusion as she took their order. "Why are you doing this?" Abigail asked once they were alone, arranging her faded skirts self-consciously. "You don't even know me." "I know enough." Mitchell's eyes were the color of the sky after a storm. "I know you've stayed in this town despite how they treat you. I know you work harder than most men I employ, and I know that blackberry jam of yours is the best I've tasted since my mother passed." Heat crept into Abigail's cheeks. "My mother taught me the recipe before she died." "She taught you well." He paused, studying her face. "I've wanted to speak to you for some time now, Miss Winters. I just never found the right moment until today. You've been watching me." The thought was both unsettling and oddly thrilling. Noticing, he corrected, "There's a difference." As they ate their meal, Abigail slowly relaxed. Mitchell spoke of his ranch, of the new breeding stock he'd purchased from back east, of his hopes to expand the operation. He asked about her preserves, seeming genuinely interested in her process. Not once did he mention her father or their family's fall from grace. By the time they finished, Abigail realized she'd laughed more in 1 hour than she had in the past year. The weight of the town's judgment seemed lighter somehow, less significant under Mitchell's attentive gaze. "May I call on you tomorrow?" he asked as they stood outside the hotel. "I'd like to show you something." Abigail hesitated, the practical part of her mind reminding her that men like Mitchell Larson didn't court women like her without ulterior motives. But another part, the part that had been slowly dying under the town's cruelty, desperately wanted to believe in this unexpected kindness. "Yes," she found herself saying. "Yes, you may." True to his word, Mitchell arrived at her cabin the following afternoon, driving a handsome buggy pulled by 2 matched bay horses. Abigail had spent the morning in a frenzy of cleaning, trying to make her humble home presentable, and had changed her dress 3 times before settling on her Sunday best, a blue cotton that had faded to a soft sky color with too many washings. "You look lovely," Mitchell said when she emerged, and the simple sincerity in his voice made her believe it might be true. He helped her into the buggy with the same careful respect he'd shown at the marketplace, then climbed up beside her. The horses set off at a gentle trot, heading north out of town. "Where are we going?" Abigail asked, acutely aware of how close they sat on the narrow seat. "There's a piece of land I want your opinion on." Mitchell guided the horses around a bend in the road. "I've been thinking of building a house there." The countryside opened before them, the rolling hills dotted with wildflowers and the occasional stand of cottonwood trees. After about 30 minutes, Mitchell turned onto a barely visible trail that wound up a gentle slope. At the top, he pulled the horses to a halt and helped Abigail down. The view took her breath away. The land stretched out in all directions, golden fields, dark forests in the distance, and the silver ribbon of the river winding through it all. "This is Larson land?" she asked, turning in a slow circle. Mitchell nodded. "The farthest edge of it. My father always considered it too remote to be useful, but I think it has possibilities." Abigail closed her eyes, feeling the warm breeze against her face. "It's beautiful." "I thought you might see it that way." Mitchell led her to a flat rock where they could sit and look out over the valley. "Most people only see the difficulty, the distance from town, the work it would take to build here, but I see what it could become." His words carried a meaning beyond the land, and Abigail found herself studying his profile, the strong jaw, the thoughtful eyes, the slight smile that seemed to appear whenever she spoke. "Why me, Mr. Larson?" The question had burned inside her since yesterday. Why show me this? Mitchell was quiet for a long moment, his gaze on the horizon. 2 years ago, I was in the general store when your father came in, looking worse than I'd ever seen him. He couldn't pay his bill, and old man Turner was threatening to call the sheriff. His voice grew softer. You came in. You were wearing a green dress with a tear in the sleeve. You looked Turner straight in the eye and offered him your mother's silver brooch to cover the debt. Abigail's throat tightened at the memory. That brooch had been her most treasured possession. Turner took it, though it was worth 10 times what your father owed, Mitchell continued. You never shed a tear, never begged. You held your head high and walked out with dignity that most people in this town couldn't understand. He finally turned to look at her. That's when I knew you were the strongest person in Abbotsville. That wasn't strength, Abigail whispered. That was survival. Sometimes they're the same thing. Mitchell reached over and, with gentle hesitation, took her hand. I've been watching you survive for 2 years, Miss Winters. I'd like the chance to see you live. The sincerity in his voice broke something loose inside her, a wall she'd built to protect herself from further hurt. A single tear slipped down her cheek, followed by another. I don't know how anymore, she admitted. Mitchell's hand tightened around hers. We could figure it out together. They sat in silence as the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the land. The moment felt fragile, suspended between what had been and what might be. I should get you home before dark, Mitchell finally said, helping her to her feet. The ride back was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence, filled with unspoken possibilities. When they reached her cabin, Mitchell walked her to the door. Would you allow me to escort you to church tomorrow? He asked. The thought of facing the entire town at Mitchell's side made Abigail's heart race with both fear and anticipation. They won't understand. I don't need them to. His gaze was steady. I only need you to give me a chance. Abigail took a deep breath. Yes, she said, I'll go with you tomorrow. The Abbotsville Community Church had never been so crowded as everyone in town seemed to have heard about Mitchell Larson escorting Abigail Winters to the service. As they walked up the steps together, Abigail could feel the weight of dozens of stares, hear the hushed whispers behind raised-hymn books. Mitchell's hand at the small of her back guided her forward, his calm presence beside her giving her courage she didn't know she possessed. They sat near the front, a deliberate choice that forced the congregation to stare at their backs rather than their faces. Reverend Porter's sermon that day was about judging others, a coincidence that made Abigail wonder if perhaps God did have a sense of humor after all. Throughout the service, Mitchell's shoulder remained pressed against hers, a silent reminder that she wasn't facing this alone. After the benediction, Mitchell didn't rush her out but instead steered her toward the church steps, where the congregation traditionally gathered to socialize. It was a bold move that left Abigail breathless with anxiety. Mitchell, a voice called out. An older man with Mitchell's jawline approached his father, Edward Larson, accompanied by a stern-looking woman who could only be his mother. We missed you at breakfast this morning. I wanted to make sure I was on time to escort Miss Winters, Mitchell replied evenly, his hand finding Abigail's elbow in a gesture that wasn't lost on his parents. Martha Larson's eyes narrowed slightly as she assessed Abigail's worn but carefully mended dress. Miss Winters, I don't believe we've been formally introduced. No, madam, Abigail said, forcing herself to meet the older woman's gaze. I don't believe we have. Something that might have been respect flickered in Martha's expression. Perhaps you join us for Sunday dinner. Since my son seems so determined to make your acquaintance. It wasn't a warm invitation, but it wasn't a rejection either. Abigail glanced at Mitchell, who nodded almost imperceptibly. I would be honored, Mrs. Larson, Abigail replied. The Larson ranch house was everything Abigail had imagined, and more a sprawling 2-story structure with wide porches and tall windows that caught the afternoon light. Inside, it was furnished with pieces that had clearly come from back east, elegant without being ostentatious. Dinner was a tense affair, with Martha Larson asking pointed questions about Abigail's background while Edward remained largely silent, studying his son more than his guest. Mitchell fielded most of his mother's inquiries, smoothly redirecting the conversation whenever it veered too close to painful subjects. After the meal, Mitchell suggested a walk around the grounds. The moment they were out of earshot of the house, he turned to Abigail. "I apologize for my mother." "She's protective. She has every right to be," Abigail said, looking back at the imposing house. "Your family has a legacy to protect. I'm hardly the kind of woman they imagined for their son." Mitchell stopped walking, turning to face her directly. "What kind of woman do you think they imagined?" "Someone from a good family, someone with money and connections, someone whose father didn't drink himself to death owing half the town." "I'm not interested in their imagination," Mitchell said, his voice low and intense. "I'm interested in what I see when I look at you. And what do you see?" Abigail asked, hardly daring to breathe. "A woman who rebuilds herself every day from whatever pieces life has left her. A woman who faces cruelty with dignity. A woman I can't stop thinking about." He took a step closer. "A woman I'd like to court properly if she'll have me." Abigail's heart thundered in her chest. "Mitchell, we've known each other for 2 days." "I've known you for 2 years," he corrected. "You're just getting to know me." A small laugh escaped her. "Your parents will never approve. They'll learn to." "My father already respects your resilience, even if he won't admit it yet." Mitchell reached for her hand. "I'm not asking you to decide everything now. I'm just asking for permission to call on you, to spend time together, to see where this might lead." Looking into his earnest face, Abigail found herself nodding. "Yes," she said softly. "I'd like that." Over the next few weeks, Mitchell became a regular visitor at Abigail's cabin. He brought books he thought she might enjoy, fresh vegetables from the ranch's kitchen garden, and once a kitten he'd rescued from a barn cat's too large litter. Sometimes they simply sat on her small porch, talking about everything and nothing as the summer days stretched long and golden. The town's reaction to their courtship was predictably mixed. Some, like Silas Thompson, continued to make snide remarks when Mitchell wasn't around. Others, seeing which way the wind was blowing, suddenly discovered they'd always admired Abigail's resilience. A few, like Mrs. Patterson at the hotel, seemed genuinely pleased to see happiness finding its way to someone who'd known too much sorrow. On a warm evening in late August, Mitchell arrived with his buggy and a picnic basket. "I thought we might have supper at that spot I showed you," he suggested. "The sunset should be spectacular tonight." They drove in comfortable companionship, Mitchell telling her about a new foal born on the ranch, Abigail sharing news of an order for her preserves from the hotel in the next town over. By the time they reached the hilltop, the western sky was already beginning to blush with color. Mitchell spread a blanket beneath a lone oak tree, and they sat together watching as the sun painted the clouds in shades of gold and crimson. The food, cold chicken, fresh bread, and peaches from the ranch orchard tasted better in the open air with such a view. "I've been thinking," Mitchell said as the last sliver of sun disappeared below the horizon, "about building that house we discussed." Abigail turned to look at him, catching something in his tone that made her pulse quicken. "Have you decided to do it?" "That depends." Mitchell shifted to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Abigail, I know it hasn't been long, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you. I want to build a life with you here on this hill if you'll have me." The world seemed to hold its breath as Abigail stared at him, unable to believe what she was hearing. "Mitchell, your parents have come to respect you, even if my mother won't admit it yet." He squeezed her hands. "And even if they hadn't, it wouldn't matter. This is my choice, Abigail. You are my choice." Tears welled in Abigail's eyes, tears of disbelief and hope and a joy so profound it hurt. "I never thought I'd have this," she whispered. "A chance at happiness, a chance at love." "Is that a yes?" Mitchell's voice held a note of vulnerability she'd never heard before. Abigail looked at the man before her, the man who had taken her hand in the marketplace when everyone else had turned away. The man who saw strength where others saw shame. The man who had given her back her dignity with a simple act of respect. "Yes," she said, her voice growing stronger. "Yes, Mitchell Larson, I will marry you." His smile was like sunrise breaking over the plains, sudden and brilliant and full of promise. Mitchell reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a ring with a single pearl nestled in a setting of delicate gold leaves. "It was my grandmother's," he explained as he slipped it onto her finger. "She was a pioneer woman who helped build our ranch from nothing. My grandfather always said she was the strongest person he'd ever known." His eyes met Abigail's. It seemed fitting. The pearl caught the fading light as Abigail turned her hand, hardly able to believe the sight of such a beautiful thing on her work-roughened finger. "It's perfect," she whispered. Mitchell cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle as a prayer. When his lips met hers, Abigail felt something inside her heal, a wound so old and deep she'd forgotten it was there until this moment when it finally closed. The wedding was held in October, when the cottonwoods turned gold and the air carried the first hint of winter. To Abigail's surprise, most of the town attended, their earlier cruelty seemingly forgotten in the face of such a romantic story. Martha Larson had slowly warmed to her future daughter-in-law, especially after discovering Abigail's skill with a needle could rival her own. Reverend Porter performed the ceremony in the church where Abigail had once sat alone Sunday after Sunday, bearing the weight of whispered judgment. Now she walked down the aisle on Edward Larson's arm, a concession that had brought tears to Mitchell's eyes when his father offered, toward a future she'd never dared to imagine. "I, Mitchell James Larson, take you, Abigail Grace Winters, to be my lawfully wedded wife," Mitchell said, his voice carrying clearly through the church. "To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part." When Abigail repeated the vows, her voice didn't waver. The girl who had survived on scraps of dignity, who had faced the town's scorn with her head held high, was gone. In her place stood a woman who knew her own worth not because a man had chosen her, but because she had chosen to believe in possibility again. "You may kiss the bride," Reverend Porter announced, and Mitchell did so with a tenderness that brought sighs from even the most hardened gossips in attendance. As they walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, Abigail caught sight of Silas Thompson standing awkwardly near the back of the church. Their eyes met briefly, and to her surprise, he gave her a small nod of what might have been respect. The reception was held at the Larson Ranch, with tables set up on the wide lawn and lanterns hung from the trees. As twilight deepened, Mitchell led Abigail to the center of a cleared space for their first dance as husband and wife. "Happy, Mrs. Larson," he murmured as they moved together to the fiddle's sweet melody. "More than I knew was possible," she replied, her head resting against his shoulder. Later that night, as they drove away from the celebration toward the small cabin where they would stay until their new home was built, Mitchell turned to his bride. "I have something to tell you," he said, a hint of mischief in his voice. "I've bought the general store from Old Man Turner." Abigail stared at him in surprise. "You bought Turner's store? Why would you do that?" Mitchell's smile was satisfied. "Because the first thing I did was go through his desk. I found your mother's silver brooch in his private lockbox." He reached into his pocket and pressed something into her palm. "I believe this belongs to you?" Abigail stared down at the delicate silver piece, her vision blurring with tears. The moonlight caught the small diamonds that formed a forget-me-not flower in the center. "I never thought I'd see this again," she whispered, running her finger over the cool metal. "My father gave this to my mother on their wedding day, and now you have it on ours." Mitchell lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "A reminder that some things that seem lost can find their way back to us." Abigail leaned across the seat and kissed him, pouring into that gesture all the gratitude and love she couldn't find words for. Spring came early the following year, bringing with it the completion of their home on the hilltop. It was a handsome two-story house with wide windows to catch the valley views, and a wraparound porch where Abigail could sit and watch the sunset. Mitchell had insisted on a large kitchen with plenty of space for canning, and a room they both referred to only as the nursery, their eyes meeting with shared hope whenever it was mentioned. On moving day, half the ranch hands turned out to help transport furniture up the long drive. By evening, exhausted but satisfied, Mitchell and Abigail stood on their porch, watching as the last wagon disappeared down the hill. "Welcome home, Mrs. Larson," Mitchell said, slipping his arm around her waist. Abigail leaned against him, marveling at how much her life had changed in less than a year. From the desperate woman setting up her wares at the edge of the marketplace to the mistress of her own home, married to a man who looked at her like she was the sunrise after a long night. "I have something to tell you," she said, turning in his arms to face him. "Something I've been saving for this moment." Mitchell's eyes were curious. "What is it?" Abigail took his hand and placed it gently on her still flat abdomen. "Our family is already growing." The doctor confirmed it yesterday. The joy that bloomed across Mitchell's face was something Abigail knew she would remember until her dying day, pure, unguarded happiness that made him look younger than his 26 years. "A baby," he whispered, as if saying it too loudly might make it disappear. "Our baby." "Due in November," Abigail confirmed, laughing as Mitchell lifted her and spun her around on the porch. That night, as they lay in their new bed listening to the unfamiliar creaks of their home settling around them, Mitchell propped himself up on one elbow to look at his wife. "Do you ever think about that day at the market?" he asked. "The day I took your hand in front of everyone." Abigail nodded, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw. "I think about how scared I was and how no one laughed, even though they'd been so cruel just moments before." "I was terrified," Mitchell admitted. "Not of them, but that you might refuse me." "I almost did," Abigail confessed. "Pride is a hard thing to set aside when it's all you have left." Mitchell caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "You had so much more than that, you just couldn't see it yet." Abigail smiled, thinking of the journey that had brought them here, from humiliation to respect, from loneliness to love, from survival to life fully lived. "I see it now," she whispered, drawing him down to her. "I see everything." In the years that followed, the story of how Mitchell Larson took Abigail Winters' hand in the Abbotsville marketplace became something of a local legend. Mothers told their daughters about it as an example of true gallantry. Fathers pointed to it when teaching their sons about standing up for what's right. The town that had once jeered at Abigail now pointed to her with pride when visitors passed through their very own romance, proof that love could bloom in even the harshest conditions. And on the hilltop, in the house with the wide windows and the wraparound porch, Mitchell and Abigail Larson built the life they had imagined that summer evening beneath the oak tree. They raised 3 children, their 2 boys as steady and true as their father, and a girl with her mother's quiet strength. They weathered droughts and blizzards, market crashes and personal losses, but always with their hands firmly clasped, just as they had been that day in the marketplace where one man's courage had silenced a town's cruelty and changed 2 lives forever.